Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable chair, perhaps dim the lights a little. The day is done, the noise has faded, and the night has that particular stillness that invites quiet contemplation. I'm your sleepy historian, and I'm glad you could join me. Tonight, we're not going to march with legions or debate in the forum. Instead, we're going to pull up a stool in a smoky Pompeian tavern, or perhaps recline on a couch in a quiet villa and listen to the gentle click of glass counters on a marble board. We're going to explore the simple, intimate, and surprisingly revealing world of Roman board games. It's in these moments of leisure, after all, that a civilization often shows its truest self. As we settle in, if you feel so inclined, perhaps leave a quiet comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always a quiet pleasure to know how far these stories travel. And of course, any gentle support for the channel, a simple like or a subscription, is always deeply appreciated. Now, let the world outside fall away. Let's listen to the ghosts of games past. When we picture the Romans, our minds tend to gravitate towards the monumental, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the unyielding march of the legions. We think of gravitas, of stoic philosophy, of empire building on a scale that beggars belief. But this is, of course, an incomplete portrait. Romans were also people who got bored, who sought distraction, who craved the thrill of competition and the capricious whims of fortune. They were, in short, gamers. And the games they played were woven into the very fabric of their daily existence, from the barracks on Hadrian's Wall to the sun-drenched peristyles of senatorial estates. To understand their games is to understand their anxieties, their values, and their relationship with two of the most powerful forces in their worldview: skill, or virtus asterisk, and luck, or fortuna. The modern world often tries to romanticize this, imagining thoughtful patricians playing a game of Roman chess as a pure exercise of intellect. The reality, as is so often the case, was something far more varied, far more widespread, and frankly, far more interesting. It was a world of strategy and chance, of quiet concentration, and of loud, drunken arguments over a roll of the dice. Let us begin with the game that most fuels the Roman chess fantasy, Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum. The name itself is wonderfully evocative, translating roughly as the game of little soldiers, or more thrillingly, the game of brigands. This was the undisputed king of Roman strategy games, a contest of pure skill with no element of chance to save a foolish commander from his own blunders. Our evidence for it is frustratingly piecemeal, cobbled together from passing remarks in literature and the discovery of game boards and pieces across the former empire. We have no surviving rulebook, no Roman Hoyle to guide us. Instead, we are detectives, piecing together clues left by poets like Ovid and Martial and the encyclopedist Varro. What emerges is a picture of a game played on a grid, typically 8x12 or 10x11 squares, though the size seems to have been variable. Each player had a set of identical pieces called asterisk latrons, soldiers, or calculi asterisk pebbles, often distinguished by color, typically black and white. The goal was not to checkmate a king, there was no king piece, but to immobilize and capture the enemy's forces through strategic encirclement. The core mechanic, as best as we can reconstruct it, was custodial capture. A single enemy piece was captured and removed from the board when it was trapped orthogonally between two of your own pieces. Imagine a black piece sitting on a square. If a white piece moves to the square on its left, and another white piece moves to the square on its right, the black piece is captured. This simple rule created an incredibly complex tactical environment. It was a game of building formations, of setting traps, of sacrificing pieces to lure an opponent into a disastrous position. It was a pincer movement in miniature, a tabletop reflection of the legionary tactics that conquered the known world. Players would have had to think several moves ahead, anticipating their opponent's attempts to form a line or break through their own. A key piece, often referred to as the asterisk dux asterisk, or leader, seems to have had special movement abilities, perhaps moving more than one square at a time, adding another layer of strategic depth. The ultimate objective was to capture all of the opponent's pieces, or to trap them so completely that they had no legal moves left. It was a war of attrition and maneuver, a pure distillation of military thinking. Arvid, in his Ars Amatoria, uses the game as a metaphor for the art of seduction, advising a lover to understand the game's tactics, how to advance his pieces, how to rescue a trapped soldier, and how to fight with allied forces. This casual reference tells us two things. First, that the game was common enough for a general audience to understand the analogy, and second, that it was seen as a mark of a sophisticated, thinking mind. Marshall, the master of the witty epigram, describes a player so engrossed that he continues to play even after his house has caught fire, a darkly comedic image of total absorption. The archaeological record supports this literary evidence. Game boards for Latrunculorum have been found scratched into the flagstones of forums and basilicas, and more formal, beautifully crafted boards have been unearthed from Britain to Syria. One of the most remarkable finds was the so-called Stanway game, discovered in the grave of a pre-Roman chieftain in Essex, England, dating to around 4050 AD. This was a complete luxury set, with a wooden board and 26 glass counters, 13 white and 13 blue. It was a high-status object, buried with its owner, suggesting that proficiency in this Roman game of strategy was a desirable skill even among the recently conquered British elite. It was a tool of cultural assimilation, a way of adopting the mindset of the conqueror. But for every luxury set, there were thousands of impromptu games played by soldiers on watch duty, scratching a grid into a spare roof tile and using broken bits of pottery for pieces. It was a game that scaled perfectly with one's social standing, but the intellectual challenge remained the same for the general in his tent and the legionary in his barracks. However, to focus solely on Latrunculorum is to miss the other, arguably more prevalent, side of Roman gaming, the absolute, all-consuming passion for games of chance. If Latrunculorum was the embodiment of asterisk versus asterisk, of skill, planning, and control, then the family of games known collectively as asterisk alia asterisk, or dice, was a full-throated surrender to fortuna. The Romans had a profound and complex relationship with luck. They knew that for all their planning and engineering, a sudden storm could sink a grain fleet, a stray arrow could fell a general, and a plague could decimate a city. Alia was a way of engaging with this fundamental uncertainty of life, of tempting fate in a controlled environment, and it was an obsession. The sound of dice rattling in a cup, the shouts of victory, the groans of loss. These were the ubiquitous sounds of the Roman street, tavern, and military camp. The primary game of this type, at least during the late Republic and early Empire, was asterisk Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum asterisk, the game of 12 markings. This was a race game, a clear ancestor of modern backgammon. The board was distinctive, consisting of 3 rows of 12 squares or points. Often, these squares would contain letters, which, when read across the 3 rows, would spell out 6-word phrases. These were the Roman equivalent of barroom graffiti, offering snippets of wisdom, advertising, or cynical humor. A board found in Pompeii reads, INVIDA/TABULA/LUDRE/NESCIS/PERDES asterisk, which translates to a rather taunting envy on the board. You don't know how to play, you lose. Another famous example offers a more hedonistic philosophy. VNARI/LAVRI/LUDRE/RIDRE/OCCSD/VIVR. To hunt, to bathe, to game, to laugh. This is to live. These boards are wonderful little windows into the popular culture of the time, turning a simple game into a medium for expression. The game itself was played with 3 six-sided dice, or tesserae asterisk. Each player had 15 counters, and the object was to move all of them along a prescribed path across the 3 rows of the board and eventually bear them off, just as in backgammon. The roll of the three dice determined how many spaces a player could move their pieces. A player could move one piece the total of the three dice, or move three separate pieces according to the number on each die. The strategy came in choosing which pieces to move. Landing on a point occupied by a single opponent's piece sent it back to the start, a frustrating setback known as a blot. Landing on a point already occupied by two or more of your own pieces created a safe prime, which the opponent could not land on. The game was thus a frantic race, punctuated by moments of strategic blocking and malicious captures, all governed by the tyranny of the dice. You could be the most brilliant player in Rome, but a series of terrible rolls could see you lose to a complete novice. This was its appeal and its danger. It was a great leveler. And because money was almost always involved, it was also a source of immense social anxiety for the Roman elite. Gambling was officially illegal for most of the year. The Lex Tiscia and Lex Publicia were just a few of the laws that attempted to curb the practice, decreeing that betting was only permissible on athletic contests and only for stakes that did not exceed the value of the prize. The one great exception was the Saturnalia, the week-long festival in December when the social order was turned upside down. During Saturnalia, all of Rome, from slave to senator, could gamble openly without fear of reprisal. For the rest of the year, however, it was a vice driven underground, or rather, into the back rooms of taverns or popini. These were not charming bistros. They were often dingy, disreputable establishments, associated with heavy drinking, cheap food, and illicit activities. Yet everyone went there to play. The authorities mostly turned a blind eye, as the laws were simply unenforceable against such a popular pastime. Fines were occasionally levied, but they were seen as little more than a tax on entertainment. The emperors themselves had a famously ambivalent relationship with Alia Asterisk. Augustus, ever the careful cultivator of his public image, wrote in his personal letters, now preserved for us by the historian Suetonius, about his own gambling habits. He played for small stakes with his family and friends, admitting that he often lost, but did so with good humor. He presents himself as a gentle, recreational gambler. His successor, Tiberius, was more circumspect, but the Emperor Claudius was a genuine addict. Suetonius tells us that Claudius was so obsessed with dice that he wrote a book on the subject, a book now tragically lost to history. He even had a special gaming board built into his carriage so that he could play on the move, the pieces presumably designed not to jiggle out of place on Rome's bumpy roads. This image of the emperor, rattling his dice as he travels, is a perfect illustration of how deeply ingrained the habit was. At the other end of the spectrum were emperors like Caligula and Nero, whose gambling was portrayed by hostile historians as yet another facet of their degenerate and profligate characters, betting vast, ruinous sums with no regard for the consequences. Over time, Duodecim Scriptorum evolved into a simpler, faster game known as *tabular*. The board was streamlined, doing away with the middle row of 12 points and creating the two-track board layout that is instantly recognizable to any modern backgammon player. The rules were largely the same, but the game was quicker, allowing for more rounds and therefore more opportunities to bet. A famous account from the 5th century AD describes a legendary game played by the Byzantine Emperor Zeno. A scribe recorded a particularly unlucky roll Zeno made, which trapped him in an impossible position, and meticulously analyzed the various ways he could have played it. This level of analysis shows that even in a game of chance, there was a deep appreciation for the subtle skill involved in probability and risk management. Tabula was the culmination of the Roman race game tradition, a perfected balance of luck and strategy that proved so successful it has survived, with only minor changes, for over 1,500 years. While *Latrunculorum and Tabula represented the two great poles of Roman gaming, pure skill and skill-mitigated chance, They were by no means the only pastimes. The Roman world was filled with simpler games, the kinds of things children might play or adults might use to pass a few idle minutes waiting for an appointment. The most common of these was turni lapilli asterisk, or three pebbles. This was, in essence, tic-tac-toe. Boards for this game are the most frequently found archaeological evidence of Roman gaming, precisely because they required no special equipment. A simple grid of 9 squares could be scratched into almost any surface with a nail or a piece of sharp stone. They are found on the steps of temples, on the floors of basilicas, in amphitheaters, and at military forts. Each player had 3 pieces, pebbles, seeds, or bits of glass, and they would take turns placing them on the board, aiming to be the first to get 3 in a row. Once all pieces were placed, if there was no winner, players would take turns moving one of their pieces to an adjacent empty square until one of them achieved the winning alignment. A slightly more complex variant was known as asterisk rota asterisk, or the wheel, which we would recognize as a version of 9 men's Morris. The board was a circle or square with lines radiating from the center, creating a series of intersection points. The principle was the same: get 3 of your pieces in a row. The sheer ubiquity of these simple games is perhaps more telling than the existence of the complex ones. It shows that the impulse to play was universal. It wasn't an activity reserved for special occasions. It was an everyday habit, a mental reflex for filling empty time. A market trader waiting for customers, a lawyer waiting for his case to be called, a soldier on a long watch. All could easily pass the time with a few pebbles and a hastily scratched grid. These games were the background radiation of Roman leisure, largely unremarked upon in the literature precisely because they were so commonplace, so utterly normal. They were the equivalent of a modern person scrolling through their phone or doing a crossword puzzle. It's also worth considering the physical objects of the games themselves. The materials used tell a story of social stratification. The vast majority of games were played on ephemeral or crude boards with found objects as pieces. But for the wealthy, a game set was a status symbol, an object of art to be displayed. We have found game counters made of polished bone, ivory, and beautifully colored glass, some with intricate carvings. We have boards made of marble, with inlaid patterns of more exotic stone. Dice, too, varied wildly. The common man used bone or wood, but the rich might have dice carved from ivory, amber, or semi-precious stones. There was, however, a fascinating alternative to the 6-sided asterisk tesserae asterisk, the asterisk tali asterisk, or knuckle bones. These were the actual ankle bones of sheep or goats, which had 4 distinct long sides on which they could land. Each side was assigned a different value, typically 1, 3, 4, and 6. A game was played by throwing 4 asterisk tali at once, and the best possible throw, called a Venus, was one where all 4 bones landed on a different side. The worst throw, the dog, was 4 ones. This added a different kind of probability to games of chance and seems to have been considered a slightly older, perhaps more rustic, form of dicing. So, what does this all tell us about the Romans? It reveals a culture far less monolithic than the Stoic busts and triumphal arches might suggest. They were a people deeply engaged in a constant dialogue between order and chaos, control and fate. In a game like asterisk latranculorum asterisk, they celebrated the ideal Roman man, the strategist, the cool-headed commander who sees the whole battlefield and marshals his forces with intelligence and foresight. The game was a safe arena in which to practice and display virtus asterisk. It was structured, logical, and meritocratic. The better player would always win. It mirrored the idealized vision of the Roman state itself, an engine of order and reason imposing its will upon a chaotic world. But in the rattle of the dice cup, we hear a different story. In their obsession with Alea asterisk, the Romans acknowledged the terrifying and thrilling power of fortuna. They knew that life was not a game of asterisk latranculorum asterisk. It was messy, unpredictable, and fundamentally unfair. The dice offered a way to confront this reality, to court disaster and triumph in equal measure. Gambling was a form of catharsis, an admission that for all their legions and laws, they were ultimately not in control. This tension is at the very heart of the Roman character. They were the world's greatest engineers who were also deeply superstitious. They were the master strategists who constantly consulted omens and oracles. They built an empire on order and discipline, yet they reveled in the chaos of the Saturnalia and the throw of the dice. Their board games were not just a diversion. They were a microcosm of this fundamental duality. They were a way for Romans to play out the central drama of their existence, the endless struggle between human will and the indifferent hand of fate. In the quiet click of a counter and the noisy clatter of dice, we can, if we listen closely, hear the pulse of a long-vanished world, a world of people who, in the end, were not so very different from ourselves. And now, the lamp oil is burning low, and the ghosts of the gamers have faded back into the shadows. The tavern has fallen silent, the last dice have been cast. We are left with the quiet understanding that the urge to play, to test our wits against an opponent or our luck against the universe, is one of the most enduring threads of the human story. It connects our modern world of complex board games and digital distractions to the soldier scratching a grid in the dust with his spear butt. The forms change, but the fundamental need for that structured escape remains the same. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me, journeying back to the gaming tables of ancient Rome. I hope it has given you a different, perhaps more intimate, picture of their world. Until we meet again for another late-night story, I wish you peace and a good night's rest. Sleep well.